All right, we're back in another Sound the Battle Cry, and today we're going to be talking about the moral code of the Jesuits, continuing the series on the Jesuits. If you haven't, go back and watch the other ones, starting with Ignatius Loyola, his origin story, then the founding of the order, talking about spiritual exercises and visualization. Then I did another one recently about the Black Pope and the structure of his intelligence gathering, infiltrating chameleons. And today we're going to be talking about the moral code. And the moral code is the way that the Jesuits justify all manner of sin and evil. It's a very, very important concept when it comes to studying the Jesuits and their history and understanding how they could do so many evil and wicked things and be involved in so many events throughout history, including political intrigue and subversion and revolutions and all kinds of crazy stuff, which we'll get to later. We'll talk about a lot of crazier events in the future. I'm just laying a foundation so you understand the background and their moral code and their maxims and these types of things. So then when you talk about other crazy events in the future, you can go, oh, okay, now I understand. I have the background. I understand, that this is definitely true. It's rooted in history, and I understand why all these things happen and how they could do that. So a couple more things. First of all, in continuing this from this book, History of Protestantism, by J.A. Wiley, but I add a bunch of notes throughout these sections. This is the section all about the Jesuits. I'm adding all kinds of different notes. I'm fact-checking, too, as well. If he mentions names, I go back and I show the full names of who he's quoting and checking the quotes to make sure everything's good. And then I add some other material as well, some other facts, some verses from Scripture. And also, you may be wondering, why is Crowley and Ruckman in the title? Well, this is actually going to be, this teaching today is going to connect to Aleister Crowley, the Satanist, and also, believe it or not, Peter Ruckman, the most well-known King James only independent fundamental Baptist teacher who has done a lot of damage, actually, to the King James only movement by his behavior. And so we're going to see something very interesting connecting him today to this whole thing. So make sure you stay tuned to hear about that. All right, so let's get into this and continue this series. Book 15, Chapter 4, Moral Code of the Jesuits. Let's go. We have not yet surveyed the full and perfect equipment of those troops which Loyola sent forth to prosecute the war against Protestantism. Nothing was left unthought of and unprovided for which might assist them in covering their opponents with defeat and crowning themselves with victory. They were set free from every obligation, whether imposed by the natural or the divine law. Every stratagem, artifice, and disguise were lawful to men in whose favor all distinction between right and wrong had been abolished. They might assume as many shapes as Proteus, and exhibit as many colors as the chameleon. They stood apart and alone among the human race. First of all, they were cut off from country. Their vow bound them to go to whatever land their general might send them, and to remain there as long as he might appoint. Their country was the society. They were cut off from family and friends. Their vow taught them to forget their father's house, and to esteem themselves holy only when every affection and desire which nature had planted in their breasts had been plucked up by the roots. They were cut off from property and wealth. For although the society was immensely rich, don't let them fool you, they had a lot of money. They had and they do still. Its individual members possess nothing. They take them away. They take the vow of poverty so that they can give it up to the order. But they have plenty of money, the order themselves. Nor could they cherish the hope of ever becoming personally wealthy, seeing they had taken a vow of perpetual poverty. Now, they do find ways around that as well, so that's also another thing. If it chanced that a rich relative died and left them as heirs, the general relieved them of their vow, sent them back into the world for so long a time as might enable them to take possession of the wealth of which they had been named the heirs. But this done, they returned laden with their booty and, resuming their vow as Jesuits, laid every penny of their newly acquired riches at the feet of the general. Okay, so they have all different types of strategies that they use like this to get around what would seem to be a code of ethics. So in that instance, the Jesuit inherits money. I say, okay, well, you're relieved of your vow temporarily. You're not a Jesuit anymore. Go get the money, come back. Oh, hey, now you're a Jesuit. Give the money back. Give the money to us. Go back to your vow of poverty. And that's just a very, very small example of some of the crazy stuff they do. Later on in the teaching, you're going to be blown away at some of the stuff that they justify. But let's continue. They were cut off, moreover, from the state. They were discharged from all civil and national relationships and duties. They were under a higher code than the national one, the institutions, namely, which Loyola had edited, and the Spirit of God had inspired. That's what they said. And they were the subjects of a higher monarch than the sovereign of the nation, their own general. He was the highest authority, the Black Pope. Nay, more, the Jesuits were cut off even from the Pope, because they're even willing to overthrow a Pope if they need to. For if their general held the place of the omnipotent God, much more did he hold the place of his vicar. And so it was, in fact, for so soon the members of the Society of Jesus came to recognize no laws but their own. And though at their first formation they professed to have no end but the defense and glory of the papal see, it came to pass when they grew to be strong that instead of serving the Tiara, they compelled the Tiara to serve the Society and made their own wealth, power, and dominion the one grand object of their existence. They were a papacy within the papacy, a papacy whose organization was more perfect, whose instincts were more cruel, whose workings were more mysterious, and whose dominion was more destructive than that of the old papacy. All right, so now we're going to get to talking about some of these moral maxims, okay? So let's start off with this. So stood the Society of Jesus. A deep and wide gulf separated it from all the other communities and interests. Set free from the love of family, from the ties of kindred, from the claims of country, from the rule of law, careless of the happiness they might destroy, and the misery and pain and woe they might inflict, the members were at liberty, without control or challenge, to pursue their terrible end, which was the dethronement of every other power, the extinction of every other interest but their own, and the reduction of mankind into abject slavery, that on the ruins of the liberty, the virtue, and the happiness of the world they might raise themselves to supreme unlimited dominion. This is not an exaggeration, okay? I want you to understand this is not an exaggeration. It's not hyperbole. You will see the proof over and over and over again. And many people throughout history have written about this. That's what I keep trying to say. But we have not yet detailed all the appliances with which the Jesuits were careful to furnish themselves for the execution of their unspeakably audacious and diabolical design. In the midst of these abysses, there opens to our eye a yet profounder abyss. To enjoy exemption from all human authority and from every earthly law was to them a small matter. Nothing would satisfy their lust for license save the entire abrogation of the moral law. And nothing would appease their pride save to trample underfoot the majesty of heaven. We now come to speak of the moral code of the Jesuits. Okay, and we're going to study the moral code. First, I want to comment on this where it says, nothing would satisfy their lust for license save the entire abrogation of the moral law, the doing away of the moral law. Now, I got to comment on that. Blaise Pascal. We're going to talk about Blaise Pascal because he was a huge critic of the Jesuits. He was a Catholic himself, but viciously criticized the Jesuits. We're going to look at some of his writings later, but Blaise Pascal accused the Jesuits of antinomianism. In his letters, Lettres Provinciales, charging the Jesuit casuistry undermined moral principles. And we're going to discuss that more later. But just wanted to talk about antinomianism for a second. He charged them with antinomianism. What is antinomianism, if you're not familiar with that? Antinomian means against law. Okay? It means against law. Doing away with the law of God, specifically, when it comes to biblical things. Antinomian, one of a sect who maintains that under the gospel dispensation the law is of no use or obligation, or who holds doctrines which supersede the necessity of good works and a virtuous life, from 1828 Webster's Dictionary. Okay, so this is important because there's some parallels and overlaps here. The Jesuits came up with vast schemes to justify their antinomianism. They gave the appearance that they're very strict and disciplined and all these other types of things, but they had loopholes to get around obeying God's law. And when it says, they believe under the gospel dispensation that the law is of no use or obligation, it doesn't mean, they believe the ceremonial law is done away, animal sacrifices and all that stuff. No, that's not what it's talking about, because that is done away with. Absolutely, regardless of what Hebrew roots people try to tell you. That stuff's done away. And it's not saying, antinomian is not saying, we're not talking about trying to keep the law in order to be saved. No, you don't keep the law to be saved. The Bible says, if righteousness came by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy, he saved us. Right? And over many verses like that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, an antinomian says, someone who gets saved, they are a Christian. Someone who is a Christian does not need to keep the moral law, like do not steal, do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not bear false witness, all these other types of things. They say that does not apply. And you can see the problems that causes. Now, the Jesuits were doing that, but I want to show you that has influenced modern day Christendom as a whole throughout many different denominations. If you could boil down one huge common factor between them all today, most prominently, it would be antinomianism. 100% antinomianism. They have thrown out truth, thrown out morality and standards, and the only thing they talk about is it's supposedly love, even though it's fake love. But morality and truth thrown out the window, don't care about doctrine, don't care about sin, none of that matters. It just matters, we just say we believe in Jesus and then we can do whatever we want. Okay? But, so they're antinomians. Absolutely. But you need to see how you get around that, because you can't just say, well, it doesn't apply. You have to deal with the conscience. We'll talk about that in a second. It's not as easy as just saying, well, it doesn't apply. So we have to see their moral code. Okay, the keynote of their ethical code is the famous maxim that the end sanctifies the means. You heard that right? You heard that before? The end justifies the means? Well, this is a Jesuit maxim. The end sanctifies the means. Before that maxim, the eternal distinction of right and wrong vanishes. Not only do the stringency and sanctions of the human law dissolve and disappear, but the authority and majesty of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, are overthrown. God's law is overthrown as well. There are no conceivable crime, villainy, and atrocity which this maxim will not justify. Nay, such become dutiful and holy, provided they be done for the greater glory of God. And their motto is ad majorem Dei gloriam. Ad majorem Dei gloriam, which means for the greater glory of God. By which the Jesuit means the honor, interest, and advancement of a society. In short, the Jesuit may do whatever he has a mind to do, all human and divine laws notwithstanding. And I have a scripture to go along with that. Jesus said in John 16:2, the time cometh that whosoever killeth you will think that he doeth God service. Someone could kill you and say it's because God, it's the will of God. It's a good thing. I'm not breaking God's law. I'm not sinning. It is a good thing. I am serving God by killing you. And that's what we have here. This is a very grave charge, but the evidence of its truth is, unhappily, too abundant. And the difficulty lies in making a selection. What the popes have attempted to do by the plenitude of their power, namely to make sin to be no sin, the Jesuit doctors have done by their casuistry. Okay, we're going to talk about casuistry for a second. We need to understand what that is, because there's a lot written about that. I mean, there are books and books and books written about this, and articles all about casuistry and the controversy about it, the discussion about it for many, many hundreds of years. So we're just going to do a basic overview of what it is, and then after that, we're going to look at some of these quotes from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different Jesuits commenting on how they can do away with the commandment of God. So let's look at the casuistry. I'll have a note on that. See what that is. In ethics, casuistry is a process of reasoning that seeks to resolve moral problems by extracting or extending theoretical rules from a particular case and reapplying those rules to new instances. Okay, so basically, they look at all types of concrete cases that of events that happen, and then they debate about what is the right thing to do, especially when it's ambiguous about, is it okay to do this or do that? Would it be right? Would it be breaking God's commandments to do this? And it's just debating the morality surrounding different cases. The term is also commonly used as a pejorative to criticize the use of clever but unsound reasoning, especially in relation to moral questions. It is the study of cases of conscience, remember that, and a method of solving conflicts of obligations by applying general principles of ethics, religion, and moral theology to particular and concrete cases of human conduct. It remains a common tool for applied ethics. Okay, so Jesuits were super involved. They weren't the only ones, but they were super involved in casuistry in this study. And they dedicated a lot of time to this. But they were known for using casuistry to justify sin. And you're going to see a little bit about that. But casuistry predates the Jesuits. Casuistry dates from Aristotle, and he was around 384 to 322 BC. Yet the zenith of casuistry was from 1550 to 1650, after the Jesuits were created. Okay? So that was really a huge period for the Jesuits when it came to establishing their moral code, that 100-year period in the beginning, because they spent a lot of time developing this framework to justify all their subsequent actions. But yet the zenith of casuistry was from 1550 to 1650, when the Society of Jesus used case-based reasoning, particularly in administering the sacrament of penance or confession. The term became a pejorative following Blaise Pascal's attack on the misuse of the method in his provincial letters. That's what he wrote against them. Okay? And that's when the word casuistry was used as an insult. It wasn't always that way. But once the Jesuits got involved with it, then anytime everyone said casuistry after that, they just thought about the Jesuits and it had a negative connotation. But that's because Pascal exposed what they were doing. Okay, and I'm going to prove that too. The French mathematician, religious philosopher, and Jansenist sympathizer attacked priests who used casuistic reasoning in confession to placate wealthy church donors. Pascal charged that aristocratic penitents could confess a sin one day, recommit it the next, then generously donate to the church in return to reconfess their sin in confidence of being assigned only a nominal penance. These criticisms darkened casuistry's reputation in following centuries. And so, that's just one tiny example of how they, like I said, create loopholes to get around saying, well, something could be pretty clear that it's a sin, but they'll come up with a way to get around it. And why would they want to get around it? for a wealthy church donor because they want them to keep giving money. So that's why they came up with these rules, and they developed that through casuistry. We're going to see more examples, though. For example, the Oxford English Dictionary quotes a 1738 essay by Henry St. John, 1st Viscount Bolingbroke. He was an English politician, government official, and political philosopher. But the Oxford English Dictionary quotes Henry St. John to the effect that casuistry, quote, destroys by distinctions and exceptions all morality and effaces the essential difference between right and wrong, good and evil. Okay, so that's another person besides Pascal in 1738 who was saying this about casuistry. It destroys distinctions, by distinctions and exceptions, all morality. And the difference between right and wrong and good and evil. That's very important. One of the main theses of casuists was the need to adapt the rigorous morals of the early fathers of Christianity to modern conditions and concerns. This led, in some extreme cases, to justification of usury, homicide, regicide, which is murdering kings if you didn't know, lying through mental reservation, adultery, and loss of virginity before marriage, fornication, all cases registered by Pascal in his provincial letters. He proved it. He quotes them, quotes Jesuits using casuistry to justify all these sins. Pascal's main source on Jesuit casuistry was the Jesuit Antonio Escobar's Summula Casuum Conscientiae in 1627. And then you can read Pascal's provincial letters here. You can read the whole thing, all the letters at wikisource.org/wiki/lettres provinciales. Okay, but I have the link right there. You can look it up. And then one last thing before we move on, just so we're clear on casuistry. Casuistry, from the dictionary, the science or doctrine of cases of conscience. Okay? Now we're going to focus in on that more because the conscience is so important that they knew they had to deal with the conscience if they were going to make this obedient army of zombies that would do whatever the Black Pope said. They had to deal with the conscience. So we'll talk about that. But this is the science or doctrine of cases of conscience, the science of resolving cases of doubtful propriety or of determining the lawfulness or unlawfulness of what a man may do by rules and principles drawn from the scriptures, from the laws of society, or from equity and natural reason. I'll talk about more on conscience later, and that's from 1828 Webster's Dictionary. All right, so we're done that. We're done talking about casuistry, the definition. I just wanted to make sure that we got a clear understanding about what that is, what casuistry is. Now, having established that, let's look at some of these crazy examples. First, let's back up to this sentence. What the popes have attempted to do by their plenitude of their power, namely to make sin to be no sin, the Jesuit doctors have done by their casuistry. The first and great commandment in the law, said the same divine person who proclaimed it from Sinai, is to love the Lord thy God, right? And isn't that what Jesus said? He summarized the whole law is 2 commandments. First is love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, mind, and strength. The second is to love your neighbor as yourself. All on these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Well, what did the Jesuits say about the first commandment of loving God? Well, let's look. The Jesuit casuists have set men free from the obligation to love God. Now, let's read about some of the things that they said. And I'm going to show you after who these guys were. But these are all important, authoritative, Jesuit moral theologians. Let's look. Escobar collects the different sentiments of the famous divines of the Society of Jesus upon the question, when is a man obliged to have actually an affection for God? Okay, so this Jesuit Escobar, he collects these quotes from all these other Jesuits. Okay? And let's read about some of the quotes. The following are some of these quotes. Suarez says, "It is sufficient a man love him before he dies, not assigning any particular time. Vasquez says that it is sufficient even to the point at the point of death. Others, when a man receives his baptism. Others, when he is obliged to be contrite. Others, upon holidays. But Castro Paulo disputes all these opinions, and that justly. Hurtado de Mendoza pretends that a man is obliged to do it once every year. I don't call them father, that's what he says. Koenig believes a man to be obliged once in 3 or 4 years, Henriquez once in 5 years. But Phileudius affirms it to be probable that in rigor a man is not obliged every 5 years. When then? He leaves the point to the wise. We are not, says Sermond, so much commanded to love him as not to hate him. Thus do the Jesuit theologians make void the first and great commandment in the law. I mean, listen to how insane this is. This is ridiculous. So the Bible says, Jesus Christ said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the Jesuit moral theologians say, well, when do you love God? Some say, well, only when you die. Some, once every 5 years. Another guy says, well, it's not so much we need to love him as not to hate him. These are the crazy things that they would say, come up with, in order to get around and subvert the commandment to love God. This is what casuistry is, that the Jesuits perfected. And this is how they justified breaking God's commandments. And that's just one example with the commandment to love God. Now, who were these guys? Because it's important to know, this isn't just quoting random people. Who was Escobar? Antonio Escobar Mendoza. These guys were all, alive around the 1500s and 1600s. He was a leading ethicist of his time. From Spain. He was educated by Jesuits before entering the order. He was part of the Jesuit order. Okay, and you can see all types of things that he did. Published a bunch of works. He used to employ the most popular ethical method called casuistry. Then we have Suarez. Francisco Suarez, Jesuit, was a Spanish Jesuit priest, philosopher, theologian, one of the leading figures of the school of Salamanca movement, generally regarded among the greatest scholastics after Thomas Aquinas. Okay? So these aren't nobodies. Because you might think, oh, was this just some, look at this. Also, let me just finish this quote. This is some crazy stuff. His work is considered a turning point in the history of Second Scholasticism, marking the transition from its Renaissance to its Baroque phases. According to Christopher Shields and Daniel Schwartz, figures as distinct from one another in place, time, and philosophical orientation as Leibniz, Grotius, Pufendorf, Schopenhauer, and Heidegger all found reason to cite him as a source of inspiration and influence. Inspiration from the Jesuit Francisco Suarez. Okay? So these aren't nobodies. All these quotes that I was just reading about these men that were, making excuses for why we don't need to love God or only need to do it every 5 years, these are very well-respected Jesuits throughout history and influencing even people to this day, even scholars. Fernando Castro Paulo, was a Spanish Jesuit theologian. At the age of 15 in 1596, he entered the Jesuits. He taught philosophy at Valladolid, moral theology at Compostela, scholastic theology at Salamanca. Later, he became rector of the College of Medina and consultor and qualificator of the Holy Inquisition. Here's another one. Hurtado de Mendoza. Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza was a Basque conceptualist, philosopher, theologian. He was a teacher of theology and philosophy in Valladolid, occupied a chair at the University of Salamanca. Hurtado belonged to the third generation of Jesuit scholars and initiated the shift from the more realist positions of Francisco Suarez and Gabriel Vasquez towards conceptualism for that generation. And then here's another one, Koenig. Giles de Koninck was a Flemish Jesuit theologian. Alphonsus Liguori considers Koninck a moral theologian of distinction. Two more. Actually, three more. Enrique Henriquez was a Portuguese Jesuit theologian. Born at Oporto, age 16 in 1552, he entered the Jesuits, became known for his philosophical and theological erudition. He taught both these branches at the Jesuit colleges of Cordova and Salamanca. In the latter place, he numbered Francisco Suarez and Gregory de Valencia among his pupils. Okay? Filiudius, that is actually, his name is Vincenzo Filiucci. He was an Italian Jesuit moralist. He entered the Jesuits at the age of 18, made the usual course in classic science, philosophy, theology. He professed philosophy and mathematics for some years and later became rector of the Jesuit College in Siena. Being summoned to Rome to fill the chair in moral theology in the Roman College, he taught there for 10 years with great distinction. Pope Paul V appointed him penitentiary of St. Peter's, a post he filled until his death in the following pontificate. As an authority in moral theology, Father Filiucci has ever been accorded high rank. Not my father. I just don't like reading that. I really don't. And last one, Sermon. Jacques Sermon was a French scholar and Jesuit. Sermon was born in Riom, Auvergne. He was educated at the Jesuit College of Billom, having been a novice at Verdun. And upon Masson, he entered into the order in 1576. After having taught rhetoric at Paris, he resided for a long time in Rome as secretary to Claudia Acquaviva, the fifth superior general of the Jesuits. Okay, secretary to the Black Pope. In 1637, he was confessor to Louis the 13th, King of France. Okay, so again, why did I read all that? Because these guys are not nobodies. I want it to sink in that these aren't some fringe edge cases. This isn't stuff out of context. These are the top, well-respected Jesuit moral theologians, and they're all spewing this garbage. And you might say, oh, that was back in the 1600s. Yeah, it laid the foundation for subsequent actions, as I said. That's what they did. And many people have written about this. Let's continue. I promise I'm not going to do that again with all those little biographies. I just wanted you to see that, who these guys were. Because they just, J.A. Wiley, he just kind of throws their last names in there, but I wanted you to see these all are important Jesuits. All right, let's continue. The second commandment in the law is thou. Remember, by the way, we're getting to even crazier stuff later in the teaching, so don't tune away yet. The second commandment in the law is thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. This second great commandment meets with no more respect at the hands of the Jesuits than the first. Their morality dashes both tables of the law in pieces. Charity to man it makes void equally with the love of God. The methods by which this may be done are innumerable. The first of these is termed probabilism. Okay, so we got to understand what that is now. So we learned about casuistry, but now we'll learn at probabilism. It's not going to be as long of a definition. This is a device which enables a man to commit any act, be it ever so manifest a breach of the moral and divine law, without the least restraint of conscience, remorse of mind, or guilt before God. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. Let me finish this paragraph explaining what probabilism is. Then we're going to talk about the conscience for a second, because it's such an important thing to know, not only in regards to the Jesuits, but honestly in general. Got to make sure you understand this. So, what is probabilism? By way of answer, we shall suppose that a man has a great mind to do a certain act, of the lawfulness of which he is in doubt. He finds that there are two opinions upon the point. The one probably true, to the effect that the act is lawful. The other more probably true, to the effect that the act is sinful. Under the Jesuit regimen, the man is at liberty to act upon the probable opinion. The act is probably right, but more probably wrong. Nevertheless, he is safe in doing it, in virtue of the doctrine of probabilism. It is important to ask, what makes all opinion probable? To make an opinion probable, a Jesuit finds easy indeed. If a single doctor, a moral theologian, has pronounced in its favor, though a score of doctors may have condemned it, or if the man can imagine in his own mind something like a tolerable reason for doing the act, the opinion that it is lawful becomes probable. It will be hard to name an act for which a Jesuit authority may not be produced, and harder still to find a man whose invention is so poor as not to furnish him with what he deems a good reason for doing what he is inclined to. And therefore, it may be pronounced impossible to instance a deed, however manifestly opposed to the light of nature and the law of God, which may not be committed under the shield of the monstrous dogma of probabilism. Very evil. Okay, so basically what it is, let's just summarize. They make it so there's two choices. Instead of it being, one's right and one's wrong, they put it all into a gray area. One's probably right or more probably right. So now it takes away the cut and dry distinction of right and wrong. And then again, as he said, all you need is one theologian to say it's okay, and it's fine with them. And even their own mind, if they can find a reason why it was okay, it justifies it. And it's just, all it is trying to find a way to justify sin. That's it. But it's to get around the conscience. Now, let's go back to this quote here, because this is really important. Okay? It's up here. It says, this is a device which enables a man to commit any act without the least restraint of conscience. And let me show you why that's so important. Let's talk about the conscience for a second. Let's look at this verse. Romans chapter 2, verse 15. Their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. Okay? So this is a very clear passage in the Bible talking about the conscience, and that the conscience can accuse you or excuse you. If you do something bad, it accuses you. You do something good, excuses. It's good. So let's learn a little bit more about that. I got a good quote here from Albert Barnes, and then a few other things to say about that. Their conscience. This word properly means the judgment of the mind respecting right and wrong, or the judgment which the mind passes on the morality or immorality of its own actions, when it instantly approves or condemns them. Its design is to answer the purpose of an ever-attendant witness of a man's conduct, to compel him to pronounce on his own doings, and thus to excite him to virtuous deeds, to give comfort and peace when he does right, to deter from evil actions by making him, whether he will or no, his own executioner. And let's look at an example of this in John 8:9. Jesus had rebuked the people there. He without sin cast the first stone, and they all walked away. Remember? Well, look at what it says. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. Okay? So Jesus, says the statement to them, to these Pharisees, he that is without sin cast the first stone. And they all stood there and thought that, and they realized, well, they're not without sin. They thought about their sin. And then it says, being convicted by their own conscience. So your conscience is put there by God, and one of its purposes is to convict you of your sin when you do something wrong. That's what the conscience is supposed to do. Now that becomes a big problem for people like the Jesuits, who don't want something like the conscience or anything else or anyone else getting in the way of what the Black Pope wants them to do. The conscience is a hindrance, you see. It is in the way of them accomplishing their will. By nature, every man thus approves or condemns his own acts. And there is not a profounder principle of the divine administration than thus compelling every man to pronounce on the moral character of his own conduct. Conscience may be enlightened or unenlightened, and its use may be greatly perverted by false opinions. Isn't that interesting? The conscience may be greatly perverted by false opinions. Almost like moral theologians with their casuistry and probabilism. Its province is not to communicate any new truth, it is simply to express judgment and to impart pleasure or inflict pain for a man's own good or evil conduct. Albert Barnes. Okay, that was his comment on that verse, Romans chapter 2, verse 15. So that's a little bit of a description of what the conscience is supposed to do. Here's a few more points. A conscience can be defiled, 1 Timothy 1:15, evil, Hebrews 10:22, and seared with a hot iron, 1 Timothy 4:2. Okay, so you're born with a conscience. Everyone is. Every single person that has ever been born with a conscience. But, when you get older, when you do something wrong, it stings you. It convicts you. Right? You don't need anyone to tell you. You do something wrong, you steal, you lie to your parents, it stings you. Tells you inside your head, that's wrong. Feel guilty. But, all depending on your background, everyone has different background and upbringing, the conscience can be altered. It can be defiled. You can numb your conscience through sin. And all depending on how crazy the sin is, keep going and going and going, it's going to change your conscience. And then pretty soon, guess what? By the time you're older, you're an adult, your conscience isn't stinging you as much as it did before. Which is all the more reason and importance, by the way, of using the law of God in evangelism. The Bible says that the purpose of the law is that all the world may become guilty, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. Okay? So the law, when you preach it, reawakens this conscience. Brings back that sting. Because you don't, often go around in this life hearing people just repeating the commandments of God and talking about the Bible in day-to-day life. Most of the time you walk around, you don't hear it. But then all of a sudden you hear someone say, do not kill, do not steal, do not bear false witness. And all these other commandments, all of a sudden it starts to stir up the conscience. And it says that every mouth may be stopped. What does that mean? Stopping the excuses, like through the probabilism, casuistry, or whatever excuse you come up with yourself. It's supposed to stop your mouth, to shut your mouth, so you don't make an excuse or justification. That's what the law is for. And then all the world may become guilty before God, so that you feel that guilt. Like when it said right there, being convicted of their own conscience. That they, other places in the Bible it says they were pricked in their hearts. And you hear the law of God. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. It shows you sin. Exposes sin. So that's why it's necessary to preach the law in evangelism. And it says the law was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. Okay, the object is to bring people to Christ, to Jesus Christ, the gospel, that they can be saved, they can be born again. But you're not going to appreciate Christ and what he did for you if you don't see that you're a sinner and that how bad your sin is, you feel the guilt of it, that you deserve to be punished for your sin. Then you appreciate the free gift of salvation when it's offered. But those who don't feel that guilt, their conscience is defiled, They don't care. They don't appreciate you cast the pearls before swine. It says they will trample it underfoot. They will turn again and rend you because they don't appreciate it. Okay, so that's the importance of the law when it comes to the conscience. Just a little side note there. But so a conscience can be defiled, evil, seared with the hot iron. That's a really bad condition to be in. A conscience can become defiled through sin, but it becomes seared with the hot iron, no longer convicts of sin when justifications for sin are developed, especially using the Bible to justify sin. That's the most dangerous thing that you can do. This is what happened to the Pharisees who always attacked Jesus. Luke 16:15, Jesus said, he said unto them, ye are they which justify yourselves before men, but God knoweth your hearts. And, the Jesuits are Pharisees, 100%. And what did the Pharisees do? They justified themselves, justified their sin, always found loopholes for sin. Most people do not want to think of themselves as a bad person. They want to think of themselves and appear moral and religious. They need justification for sin. This is such an important point, important concept, because, you ask most people, you think you're a good person? They'll say, yeah. Do you think you're on your way to heaven? Yeah, I think so. I hope so. They say these types of things. Do most people openly worship the devil? No. Even witches don't even want to admit that. Even Satanists. Even Satanists in the Church of Satan, Satanic Temple, they say, oh, he's just an archetype. It's just a symbol. We don't actually worship the devil. Nobody wants to own it and say, yes, Lucifer is my master. I worship him. No one wants to say that. Why is that? Because the conscience is just so powerful, they don't even want to admit it. So everyone needs some type of justification to get around it. Yes, I'm a good person. I try to do the right thing, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is none righteous, no, not one. It's a lie. They're not a good person. There is none that doeth good. But they want to think that. Everyone wants to think that they're good. No one wants to perceive themselves as evil. Even people who murder, serial killers, have to dehumanize their victims in order to do it. There's still somewhere deep down in there the conscience that just hinders things. It's powerful. And the Jesuits understood that. The evil genius of Ignatius Loyola and the Black Popes, man, did they understand that. And they got those scholars together, the moral theologians, and they said, let's come up with the most elaborate theologies that subverts the conscience, gets people around the conscience, creates loopholes and justifications so that we can have these Jesuits do anything we want them to do. And there will be nothing hindering them from obeying and doing it. Pretty wild. But let's continue. That's an important point about the conscience and probabilism. We are neither indulging in satire nor incurring the charge of false witness bearing in this picture of Jesuit theology. It's not. It's not a joke. It's not satire. It's not hyperbole. It's not a lie. These are documented facts. A person may do what he considers allowable, says Emmanuel Sá. Who's that? Manuel de Sá was a Portuguese Jesuit priest, theologian, and exegete. He distinguished himself as a student at University of Coimbra, and at the age of 15 joined the Jesuits, and soon afterward taught philosophy, first at Coimbra, next at Gandia, where he also acted as tutor to Francis Borgia, who was at the time Duke of Gandia, who was considering joining the Jesuit order. And then he became the third superior general Black Pope, and now Francis Borgia is also venerated as a saint. He's been made a saint. So Manuel de Sá tutored Francis Borgia, the third Black Pope. So when he says this quote, that's an authority. That is a very well-respected authority. A person may do what he considers allowable. says Emmanuel Saw, of the Society of Jesus, according to a probable opinion, although the contrary may be more probable one. The opinion of a single grave doctor is all that is requisite. That's all you need. That's all that they need. If one guy said it, one Jesuit said, hey, it's okay, hey, then it's okay. A person may do what he considers allowable. It kind of sounds like he may do whatever he wants. Now, that kind of sounds like to me like something else I've heard. Oh wait, there was a saying that someone had called, do what thou wilt. Do what thou wilt. Who was that? Aleister Crowley. Doesn't this statement sound like the Satanist Aleister Crowley's motto of do what thou wilt? Well, believe it or not, Crowley actually took that statement from a Catholic Franciscan friar, as well as the name for his commune in Sicily. I don't know if you knew that. This might be news to you, but Crowley took both of those things from a Catholic. Let's look. The Abbey of Thelema, and Thelema, by the way, is a Greek word for will, and is the religion that was started by him. People that follow his teachings are called Thelemites. The Abbey of Thelema is a small house which was used as a temple and spiritual center, founded by Aleister Crowley and Leah Herzig of Cefalù in Sicily in 1920. Okay, if you don't know who Aleister Crowley was, they called him the most wickedest man in the earth, the great beast 666, the most infamous Satanist of the 20th century, right? He influenced a lot of people. I have a video about him, about his influence on music. It's called The Power of Music. And he influenced, people like Ozzy Osbourne and The Doors and David Bowie and Iron Maiden and all this stuff, right? So a hugely influential Satanist. And he had this commune called the Abbey of Thelema in Sicily. Well, in the 16th century, Francois Rabelais used Theleme, the French form of the word Thelema, as the name of a fictional abbey in his famous books Gargantua and Pantagruel, which was a fictional story he wrote about some giants. And in the book was this place. I'll show you. The name was borrowed from the Franciscan friar Francois Rabelais' satire Gargantua and Pantagruel, where an Abbé de Theleme, literally Abbey of Thelema. Aleister Crowley took the name for his place in Sicily from this Franciscan friar's story. It was called Abbey of Thelema in the story. And the Abbey of Thelema in that story is described as a sort of anti-monastery where the lives of the inhabitants were spent not in laws, statutes, or rules, but according to their own free will and pleasure. What does that sound like? The idealistic utopia was to be the model of Crowley's commune, while also being a type of magical school, giving it the designation Collegium ad Spiritum Sanctum, a college towards the Holy Spirit. Talk about blasphemy. It is in the first book where Rabelais writes of the Abbey of Thelema, built by the giant Gargantua. The abbey was built by a giant. It pokes fun at the monastic institutions, since this abbey has a swimming pool, maid service, and no clocks in sight. But below the humor was a very real concept of utopia and an ideal society. Rabelais gives us a description of how the Thelemites of the abbey lived and the rules they lived by. So here's a quote from the story. All their life was spent not in laws, statutes, or rules, but according to their own free will and pleasure. They rose out of their beds when they thought good. They did eat, drink, labor, sleep when they had a mind to it, and were disposed for it. None did awake them. None did offer to constrain them to eat, drink, nor do any other thing. For so had Gargantua established it. In all their rule and strictest tie of their order, there was but this one clause to be observed. Do what thou wilt. Do what you will. And that's where Aleister Crowley got it from. a 16th century Catholic Franciscan friar. He did not originate it. And there's more to that story, by the way. There is more Catholic connection to that man, Mr. Crowley. But that's for another day. But I just want to show you how deep this stuff goes. You think the little horn power isn't as influential as you thought? Well, it is. That great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth is very far-reaching. And there's a lot more to it. In fact, you just wait till some future shows. I'm going to blow your mind about that type of stuff. Now, one more thing before we move on here. In the mid-18th century, still before Aleister Crowley was even around, Sir Francis Dashwood inscribed the adage on a doorway of his abbey in Medmenham, where it served as the motto of the Hellfire Club. You heard of that? Hellfire Club? Yeah, Benjamin Franklin was a member of it. Well, Rabelais's Abbey of Thelema has been referred to by later writers Sir Walter Besant, the husband of Annie Besant from the Theosophists, and James Rice in their novel The Monks of Thelema, 1878. Okay? But in the mid-18th century, in the 1700s, Sir Francis Dashwood had the motto of "Do what thou wilt" at the Hellfire Club before Aleister Crowley ever said it. Okay, so it came around before. But before that, it came from the Franciscan friar, Catholic. Okay, so that's a little fact there for you. Of the far-reaching influence of the Catholic Church. But anyways, so a person may do what he considers allowable. It's the same thing as "do what thou wilt." The Jesuits' motto basically is "do what thou wilt." And they came up with the Casuistry and Probabilism and all this stuff in order to justify "do what thou wilt." That's all it is. Let's continue. A yet greater doctor, Feliucci, right? So you can get this thing to pop up. Vincenzo Feliucci, Italian Jesuit. Okay? Greater yet doctor of Rome confirms him in this. It is allowable, says he, to follow the less probable opinion, even though it be the less safe one. Okay, so you got the choice. This is more probably the right thing to do. This is less probably. He says it's okay to go with the less probable opinion, even though it's the less safe one, even though it's more probably the wrong choice. He says it is allowable. It's okay. Which is what? It's a license to sin. It's giving you the justification to do the wrong thing, because you'll have an excuse. That is the common judgment of modern authors. Of two contrary opinions, says Paul Layman, touching the legality or illegality of any human action, every one may follow in practice or in action that which he should prefer. It's just preference. That's it. Although it may appear to the agent himself less probable in theory. He adds, a learned person may give contrary advice to different persons according to the contrary probable opinions, whilst he still preserves discretion and prudence. We may say with Pascal, these Jesuit casuists give us elbow room at all events. Anything they justify. Now, who is that? Paul Layman. He was, again, a Jesuit, Austrian Jesuit, important moralist. I'm not going to read all that there, but you can see he was one of the greatest moralists and canonists of his time. And extensively used as a textbook in seminary, some of his writings. All right? So again, very important. Jesuit theologians, not nobodies. And they're saying, hey, it's okay to go with the less safe of the probable choices. It is and it is not is the motto of this theology. It is and it is not, both at the same time. Both things are okay. It is the true lesbian rule. What do you mean lesbian? Well, there is this island called Lesbos. That's what it's talking about. It's the true lesbian rule which shapes itself according to that which we wish to measure by it. Would we have any action to be sinful, the Jesuit moralist turns this side of the code to us. Would we have it to be lawful? He turns to the other side. Right and wrong are put thus in our own power. We can make the same action a sin or a duty as we please, or as we deem it expedient. Almost like the devil in the Garden of Eden, when he says, "For that in that day you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." You determine what is good and evil. You can decide. It's up to you. And you can question God, right? Isn't that what the devil's always doing? Yea, hath God said? Is that what God really said? They question it. It's the same thing. It's the hiss of the serpent. To steal the property, slander the character, violate the chastity, or spill the blood of a fellow creature is most probably wrong. But let us imagine some good to be got by it, and it is probably right. That's how they do it. That's how they do it. The end justifies the means. The Jesuit workers, for the sake of those who are dull of understanding and slow to apprehend the freedom they bring them, have gone into particulars and compiled lists of actions esteemed sinful, unnatural, and abominable by the moral sense of all nations hitherto, but which, in virtue of this new morality, are no longer so, no longer sinful, unnatural, and abominable, according to the Jesuit. And they have explained how these actions may be safely done, with a minuteness of detail and a luxuriance of illustration in which it were tedious in some cases, immodest in others, to follow them. They spent a lot of time going through every last detail to justify every sin you could think of. One would think that this was license enough. You think, oh, that's enough to justify their sin, right? You got the Casuistry, and they came up with the Probabilism, and that'd be enough, right? Well, that wasn't enough for them. What more can the Jesuit need? Or what more can he possibly have, seeing by a little effort of invention he can overleap every human and divine barrier and commit the most horrible crimes on the mightiest possible scale and neither feel remorse of conscience nor fear of punishment? But this unbounded liberty of wickedness did not content the sons of Loyola. They panted for a liberty, if possible, yet more boundless. They wished to be released from the easy condition of imagining some good end for the wickedness they wished to perpetrate, and to be free to sin without the trouble of assigning even to themselves any end at all. This they have accomplished by the method of directing the intention. That's the other thing that they did. This is crazy. Oh yeah, this is the next thing. We're going to talk about Ruckman in a second, just to let you know. Because I said we were going to, and we're going to. But if you see here, because before they're like, oh, we got to find some good in it. There has to be some end, right? The end justifies the means. Well, even that they thought wasn't far enough. They needed complete freedom to do whatever they wanted. And so the directing of the intentions, the next thing we're going to talk about. And we're actually getting closer to the end of the notes. This is a new ethical science unknown to those ages which were not, well, back then it was, unknown to those ages which were not privileged to bask in the illuminating rays of the Jesuits. He's just being sarcastic. And it is as simple as convenient. It is the soul, they argued, that does the act so far as it is moral or immoral. As regards the body's share in it, neither virtue nor vice can be predicated of it. Okay. I'm going to finish a couple more sentences about this concept of the soul, and then we'll talk about Ruckman in a second, because this is relevant. Okay. So they say it's the soul that does the act. The body, in regards to the body's share in it, neither virtue nor vice can be predicated of it. It's not the body's fault. If, therefore, while the hand is shedding blood, or the tongue is calumniating character, or uttering a falsehood, the soul can so abstract itself from what the body is doing. Okay? So, they separate the soul and the body. Okay? So that when the body is doing something bad, when the body is sinning, it doesn't affect the soul, so the soul is not sinning. You see? And that's how they justify sin. Because they say, well, my soul didn't sin, So it doesn't count. It was only my body. The soul can so abstract itself from what the body is doing as to occupy itself the while with as to occupy itself the while with some holy theme, or to fix its meditation upon some benefit or advantage likely to arise from the deed, which it knows or at least suspects. The body is at that moment engaged in doing. The soul contracts neither guilt nor stain, and the man runs no risk of ever being called to account for the murder or theft or calumny by God, or of incurring his displeasure on that ground. We are not satirizing, we are simply stating the morality of the Jesuits. He said it's not a joke, not an exaggeration. This is actually what they teach. Okay, now this is important. We're going to talk about Ruckman now, because I want you to see the Jesuits teach that they separate the soul and the body, and that from doing that, the soul contracts neither guilt nor stain. When they do that, when someone sins, the soul is not guilty. It's not the soul that's sinning. It's only the body. Okay? It's if the soul, it is the soul that does the act. Okay, now, I'm sorry, the soul can so abstract itself from what the body is doing. Now, having established that's a Jesuit teaching, separating the soul and the body, and that when someone sins, whatever, that's the body, the soul's not actually guilty. I want you to see a teaching that Peter Ruckman has, a doctrine that he taught multiple times in multiple different books, that is pretty much the same exact teaching as this that the Jesuits taught. So let's look right here. And I'll show you where you can read more about it after. One of Peter Ruckman's many unusual teachings that seem to have originated with him, it maybe not, is what he termed spiritual circumcision. Now, you know, the Bible talks about circumcision of the heart, right? When someone's born again, they're circumcised in their heart, but it does not teach at all what he says. Even though he does not dedicate an entire book or pamphlet to it, he mentions it relatively often. Ruckmanites are known to promote it and defend it vigorously. It essentially consists of teaching that at the moment a person is converted to the gospel, the moment that they're saved, his soul is literally cut loose off his body. Before explaining any further, we will allow Ruckman to explain his views in his own words. In his own words, okay? I'm going to read you 3 quotes with the source of what Ruckman teaches, what he taught. Ruckman said, "In a saved man, the Holy Spirit has cut the flesh away from the soul and spirit." See Colossians 2:11. That body has a spirit connected with it that is different from the new spirit that lives inside of you. Peter Ruckman, Book of Romans, Bible Believers Commentary Series, and the publisher came out in 2003, page 265, okay? So Peter Ruckman has an entire commentary series on the different books of the Bible. So from that was from the Book of Romans 1. That's what he said. The Spirit has cut the flesh away from the soul and the spirit. Let's read another one. From the Bible Believers Bulletin, September 2006, page 15. A sinner dies in Christ because he could not possibly live in sin. 1 second after his spiritual circumcision, he was cut loose by a 2-edged laser going inside the body and circumcising the flesh from the soul. Okay? So he says the flesh is cut from the soul. And what does he say? He could not live in sin 1 second after his spiritual circumcision. Why is that? Because the flesh is cut from the soul. One more quote here. From Ruckman, The Unknown Bible, came out in 84, page 132. The spiritual circumcision of the believer's soul, literally, he says literally, cut loose from the inside of his fleshly body at the time of his new birth. Okay, so Ruckman has clearly taught this multiple times There's no getting around that. And he taught that it wasn't just a metaphor, that the soul is literally cut from the inside of the fleshly body away from the flesh, so that there is a physical separation between the soul and the flesh. Now, why would he teach that? In the following quotation, you can observe how Ruckman uses his spiritual circumcision to give an explanation for the doctrine of sin involving the believer. And this is from Peter Ruckman, The Death of Biblical Doctrine, which came out in 2007, page 71. If you are saved in this age, the Holy Spirit, by the way, he's a hyper-dispensationalist, so he talks about different ages. The Holy Spirit does not come in contact with your flesh. You have been cut loose. Fortunately, the new birth produces a spiritual circumcision which cuts off your soul from your flesh. Thus, the real you is not responsible for fleshy sins. Okay? What he's saying is the soul. Okay? Because the soul is the real you, right? And he's saying the soul is literally cut from the flesh. And so the real you is not responsible for fleshly sins that the body does. Although since you, the fleshy you, commit them as a works of the flesh, you will certainly reap them in the flesh, not in the soul. Okay? So, all that to say, and you can get more on this from ruckmanism.org/Ruckman's Unbiblical Spiritual Circumcision Teaching. You can find all those quotes and a ton more. Now, Ruckman is teaching that the soul is cut from the body literally at the moment of salvation, and that from that moment on, when a Christian sins, it's not his soul sinning, it's his body, his flesh, and therefore it doesn't count. Now, does this not sound like what the Jesuits were teaching? The soul can so abstract itself from what the body is doing. Now, you might say, oh, that's kind of a stretch. You're saying it sounds like the Jesuit teaching. I don't get what you're trying to say. This guy was an independent fundamental Baptist preacher. He's one of the most well-known, he's the most well-known King James only guy, who was a lightning rod for every attack that ever came against King James only, and that everyone who's a King James onlyist is called a Ruckmanite because of his bad behavior, and he was so loud and called people names, and he was really nasty. Oh, and by the way, he had divorced multiple times and was still a preacher and a pastor. Oh, and by the way, his son murdered his family and killed himself. Well, one other thing. Ruckman entered the United States military and the Army in 1944 as a second lieutenant and volunteered to serve with the occupation forces in Japan. While there, Ruckman studied Zen Buddhism and spoke of the experience of nirvana, which the Zen calls samadhi, the dislocation of the spirit from the body. Ruckman returned to the United States uneasy, unsettled, full of demons. His words. He worked as a disc jockey, a DJ, and a radio announcer by day and a drummer in various bands by night. After he began to hear voices, he met with a Jesuit priest to explore joining the Roman Catholic Church. And then he says he got converted March 14, 1949, received Jesus Christ after talking with the evangelist Hugh Pyle in the studios of WAR Radio in Pensacola. Ruckman attended Bob Jones University, where he received a master's degree and PhD in religion. Okay? So, you might say, oh, well, he got saved. Okay? So you're saying he said he went to do all this mysticism, he was filled with devils, went to go talk to a Jesuit. He admits he met with the Jesuit. Then, after his conversion, divorced, 10 years after conversion, and is teaching this doctrine that your soul is cut from your flesh, from your body, and so it basically doesn't count if you sin. Doesn't matter. Saying that the Jesuits are teaching here. And then also gave King James onlyism a really, really bad name. And in fact, most of James White's book, The King James Only Controversy, is attacking Ruckman and Ruckmanism and trying to paint everybody under that with that brush and put them all under that umbrella, even though there's been a ton of other guys that have written books defending it. It's all painted with the Ruckman brush, almost like it was by design. Not to be a conspiracy theorist, but the evidence starts stacking up the more that you look at it. And, I mean, to me, it's just staring you right in the face. So, there's a lot more we could say about that, but I'll move on from there. I thought that was pretty insane that he's teaching pretty much the Jesuits are teaching the same thing that Ruckman taught, which is, by the way, a weird doctrine that no one else teaches. All right, let's continue. We never, says the Jesuit in Pascal's letter, suffer such a thing as having formal intention to sin with the sole design of sinning. And if any person whatever should persist in having no other end but evil in the evil that he does, we break with him at once. Such conduct is diabolical. This holds true without exception of age, sex, or rank, but when the person is not of such a wretched disposition as this, we try to put in practice our method of directing the intention. Okay? So that's what they're talking about. As you can see, we're right at the end here. Last page. Which simply consists of, in his proposing to himself, as the end of his actions, some allowable object. Not that we do not endeavor, as far as we can, to dissuade men from doing things forbidden, but when we cannot prevent the action, when we can't stop people from doing wicked things, we at least purify the motive and thus correct the viciousness of the means by the goodness of the end. Such is the way in which our fathers of the society have contrived to permit those acts of violence which men usually resort in vindication of their honor. They have no more to do than to turn off the intention from the desire of vengeance, which is criminal, and to direct it to a desire to defend their honor, which according to us is quite warrantable. So he's saying all they have to do is they can do the same exact thing. Someone that's committing an act of violence, they can kill someone, and they say, hey, you were doing that out of revenge. You got to shut off that motivation and that intention, switch it in your mind to a different motivation, and now instantly the action's okay to do. That's all it is. And in this way, our doctors discharge all their duty towards God and towards man. By permitting the action, they gratify the world, and by purifying the intention, they give satisfaction to the gospel. They really subvert the conscience. They don't give satisfaction to the gospel. They don't give satisfaction to God and to the law, but they pretend to. And it's to appease their conscience. That's it. This is a secret, sir, which was entirely unknown to the ancients. The world is indebted for the discovery entirely to our doctors. You understand it now, I hope. This is a Jesuit talking. Okay? And you can read that in Pascal's letters, like I was saying. Absolutely evil. So just, you can do the same action. So, and this applies to everything. You understand that? Any sin you can think of. As long as when they're doing the sin, they can think of some type of good intention in doing it, then that justifies it. It's okay to do it. Let's read the last paragraph and we'll be done. Let us take a few illustrative cases, but only such as a Jesuit casuists themselves have furnished. A military man, says Reginald, may demand satisfaction on the spot from the person who has injured him, not indeed with the intention of rendering evil for evil, but with that of preserving his honor. See how they change it, try to twist the intentions? Oh, if someone, insults you, injures you, it's not okay to take revenge, but if you change the motive and make it about honor, then it's okay. Lessius observes that if a man has received a blow on the face, he must on no account have an intention to avenge himself, but he may lawfully have an intention to avert infamy, and may, with that view, repel the insult immediately, even at the point of the sword. Hey, someone hits you in the face, it's okay to stab them with the sword, as long as you change the intention. Right? You can't have an intention to avenge yourself, but if your intention is to avert infamy, yeah, no problem. Go ahead. Punch him back. Stab him in the face. No problem. If your enemy is disposed to injure you, says Escobar, you have no right to wish his death by a moment of hatred, though you may save yourself from harm. See how they twist it? And says Hurtado de Mendoza, we may pray God to visit with speedy death those who are bent on persecuting us, if there is no other way of escaping from it. An incumbent, says Gaspar de Hurtado, may without any mortal sin desire the decease, desire the death of a life renter on his benefice, and a son of a father, and rejoice when it happens, provided always it is for the sake of the profit that is to accrue from the event, and not from personal aversion. He can even rejoice at someone's death, as long as it's the right motivation and intention. Sanchez teaches that it is lawful to kill our adversary in a duel, or even privately, when he intends to deprive us of our honor or property unjustly in a lawsuit. Someone's trying to sue you? Kill him. No problem. Or by chicanery, and when there is no other way of preserving them. It is equally right to kill in a private way a false accuser and his witness, and even the judge who has been bribed to favor them. A most pious assassination, exclaims Pascal. He was being sarcastic. Yes, a most pious assassination. Very righteous assassination. Because it's just so insane. So utterly insane, that the reasoning that they come up with to justify the sin. And this is how they justified assassination, by the way, of all their enemies. And in future teachings, maybe we'll talk about the Cup of Borgia and all that other type of stuff. But this just shows the moral code. By the way, Reginald, that was Valerius Reginald, the Jesuit moral theologian, very well respected. And then another one was Lessius, Leonardus Lessius. It was a Flemish moral theologian from the Jesuits. And there you go. He became a professor of theology. Okay, so again, these are not from nobodies. These are authorities in the Jesuit order. Okay, so that's the end of the notes. Let's summarize all this and talk about it. So, basically, to boil it all down, you can see that the Jesuits had to do a lot of work in their studies, in their scholarship, developing theology, a moral theology that justifies any sin imaginable, gets around the conscience, so that it doesn't hinder people from doing any wicked thing that they need done. Because, the Jesuits, you might say, why do they need that? Well, because the Jesuits need them to kill, of course, or set up assassinations. Like maybe they're not the guy doing it, but they set it up. They can't have their conscience getting in the way. So they have to get around that all before they even send them out to do their missions. And then also, since they're spies and gathering information, they got to lie all the time. All these other types of sins, stealing money, whatever it is, as long as it benefits the order, they make it so they have the right. Just change the intention, and everything is designed to benefit the order, obey the orders of the Black Pope, gain more power, wealth for the order, and to stamp out all their enemies and bring them all into subjection to the Black Pope and the Pope and the power of the Vatican. That's the main goal. And so this is such a huge factor when it comes to that, because the conscience stands in the way. So we have the probabilism, we have the directing of the intention, all the studies through the casuistry, and it was all done to justify sin. That's, you just want to boil it down, is to justify sin, find loopholes for sin. So, so you can see that. And then there's a ton more examples we could give. Again, I can only give basic overviews because there's just so much information in history. You can go look it up yourself, study all these things yourselves, test it, find other books and quotes. You can see quotes from so many people from history talking about this stuff, and just prove it yourself. And then, as far as that other stuff with Crowley and that's pretty plain. And then Ruckman, someone might get upset about that, but you know what? it's pretty much the same exact thing. And even if that wasn't the Jesuits that said that, I would still tell you it's wrong, it's unbiblical, it's a false teaching, it's heresy, and it is a justification for antinomianism. So I was already against it before I even saw that. But it's just a little bit more interesting to me that the Jesuits are teaching basically the same thing. So it just adds to it. It's not just that's the only evidence that we have. Okay? So don't say that, because that's not true. We have more evidence from the Bible. We could sit here and refute it all day long. All right, so that's the end of this teaching. We might take a break, another break for a while, because I did a couple Jesuit teachings and I took a break. I just did another 2, so we might take a break for a while. But I'd like to continue, because there's a lot more events and things to cover throughout history. We have major events in the history of the Bible version issue, the founding of countries and wars and all kinds of crazy stuff. I mainly want to keep it limited to the Jesuits' role in church history, in regards to their battle against the Bible, the King James Bible, Protestants and Baptists, and these types of things. I don't really want to sit here and, I'm not going to do a bunch of teachings about their role in all these different wars and stuff. You can go read about that if you want. But on this channel, I want to mainly focus on the moral teachings and religious, biblical type of subjects. We want to keep it on the spiritual level, because that's very important. And it all ties back to, again, just to wrap this up, last thing, is back to Bible prophecy. Please, again, if you haven't, go back and watch 4 Kingdoms in Daniel and the Little Horn Power Revealed. That's very important when it comes to revealing the Antichrist power of the Roman Catholic Church coming out of Rome, the 4th kingdom. It has to. And then also we'll do more about Rome also being the religious power, the whore that rides the beast, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, Revelation 17. Because in Revelation 17, it shows a woman and a beast. A woman, there's the good church in the Bible is compared to a woman. It says, husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church. But that's a pure woman. That's a virtuous woman. A harlot is a false church, a counterfeit church. That's the harlot. So that's a religious power. The beast, and throughout the Bible, is talked about as a government power. It's a king or a kingdom. The woman rides the beast because that's the 2 keys of the gold and the silver keys of the Vatican on their flag. It's the political and spiritual power, the temporal and spiritual power of the Vatican. It's combined together. The woman is a religious power. The beast is the Antichrist state power. They have political and spiritual power, but the spiritual directs and controls the political power. Okay? And if you don't, and that's why another reason we're doing all this is to show you how it all fulfills Bible prophecy and exactly what the Bible describes as in all those verses. Okay? So, that's it for that. Thank you for watching and listening. Please like, share, subscribe. Check the links below at alternative platforms. Thank you for all your support. It really helps out a lot. And prayers. And we'll see where we'll go from here. I thank you, and I pray that you please keep praying, because I need it. God bless you and have a good day.